Good afternoon, good evening, good even morning, wherever you are in the world. Folks, I hope you're having a great Sunday or Monday, depending on where you are. Very ad hoc stream for this weekend. I know we don't have a race weekend, and I know there's not a lot of F1 fantasy to talk about right now. But I thought I'd just do something a little differently, given I won't be around for a deadline stream with Austria coming up. I thought it might be worth trying something a little different out. Don't expect it to be nearly as intense, nearly as, let's say, dynamic in the chat. Just with the fact that there isn't a race weekend on, there isn't a deadline coming up in the next couple of hours like there usually is. And I know Ewan has kind of been the inspiration for me to try something like this out, because I know he's done a few midweek streams as well. And it's not meant to be anything too serious. I think more so to bridge the gap between my team selection video and the final thoughts video going out before Austria. So I thought I'd do something a little different, probably, anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. I'll just talk for as long as I feel like we've got subjects to chat about. It doesn't need to be anything too crazy, but I did think it might be something a little different, given the fact that, we don't have or at least I won't have a stream coming up for the next race. So good to see a few people in the chat. I know it's going to be a small contingent of folks today. It's a Sunday, in Europe in particular, a Sunday night. So suspect there's probably a few people getting ready for bed, but I just thought I'd fire this up, revisit F1 Fantasy, get back up to speed on all of the topics. And I could only be going 10 minutes, but good to have you here, Count. Michael, I know you're on your way home, you were saying. So even if you're just in the background, never a bad thing. William, hope you're well, my friend. And then you and a nice man popped through a little earlier. And I think as well, for me, just trying to iron out a few kinks with the stream I had last go around. Hopefully can just reboot this, or had rebooted the system. So fingers crossed for the next stream. It may not be Silverstone, but it probably will be some other time, whatever the race is after Silverstone. Is that Belgium? Thought I'd just iron out some of the issues and see if it's working fine. So I thought I'd just pick things up with F1 Fantasy. I don't know about you guys, but I personally haven't thought about my team at all since I did my team selection video, and that's usually how I try to do it when we have weeks off in between one race and another. And so I've got my team on screen here. If you've seen my team selection video, there's probably nothing too crazy to talk about. We'll talk about Lando Norris, understandably, based on how things occurred for him in Canada. We'll go through Ferrari versus Mercedes versus a B-tier constructor, budget building now and in the future, what that means for structuring our teams. And look, if there's any other contributions in the chat, we can reel that off too. And I know, I think it's more of a, people can come and watch later in the week when they have a bit more useful information to lean on when making their decisions. So and I think kind of to the point in the chat from Count, there's not much, I feel like, particularly these weeks off, or the weekends off in between races. I find people want instant reactions to, excuse me if you can hear the dishwasher in the background, some people want instant reactions to team selection, and then people want a reaction or a point of view right up in the lead up to the deadline, which is obviously what the final thoughts are. So we'll talk about my team. We'll talk about any questions there are in the chat. I don't think it's going to be too robust, but wanted to try something a little different out. Jay, hope you're well, my friend. I did see a notification come through for your trip to Brands Hatch, so I have to watch your video on that this evening. But I suspect it would have been a fantastic weekend, so hope you, or a fantastic day out there. So I hope you had a great time watching them go around. Why don't we start from the top with a few of the talking points from Canada. I reeled off a few in my team selection thoughts, but I thought may as well rehash them for the sake of anyone watching. I need to think of a better way to present this, because I feel as though text on a page sometimes isn't the most engaging, but regardless, this is kind of my thought dump from Montreal, and probably what a lot of people are thinking about into the next race weekend and beyond. So I think, starting from the top, how do we approach this second constructor? Because my thoughts on this have been for some time a situation where we almost feel like every couple of weeks we're rotating between different premium constructors if you've gone down that route, or in some cases you've even considered maybe a B tier constructor like a V-Carb. I know I was on Haas in Japan. I think quite a few people earlier in the season were also on Haas just because of that budget upside. But I do think there's probably some thought to be had around how we want to tackle that. And I don't think this is a crazy take, put it this way, but the decisions on constructors for me kind of consist of two things. The first being, are they kind of positioned for a budget rise now and in the subsequent weeks, assuming no DNFs bring down that threshold or make it the threshold higher to reach? And then secondly, even if that does seem to be the case, all we need is one practice session where the constructor you have or may want to own looks completely off and kind of foils your plans for them for this upcoming weekend. And I think I look at Canada as a great example of that, because Ferrari obviously were a popular pick the weekend before, and the fact I can't even remember the race weekend before before Canada is kind of showing a little bit that I've definitely checked out. It was Spain, wasn't it? So I think it's kind of a thing I find with free practice. It's almost like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And Ferrari versus Mercedes is probably the one right now that a lot of people are grappling with. There's a number of you that are maybe still riding that V-Carb budget wave. But I think the vast majority, when looking at the elite data on F1 Fantasy Tools, which, for the sake of adding color to the discussion, that wasn't what I was meant to do there. For the sake of adding color to the discussion, I'll bring that up on screen here momentarily and kind of piece together what that looks like from an ownership point of view. So I think kind of the most telling thing, and this is just for the top 500 on F1 Fantasy Tools or the Patreon 500, it can be either or. Let's just use the global 500 for time being. So just about everyone in the top 500 in the world has McLaren. So they're a staple in just about everyone's team. I assume almost all of you watching this video or this stream have McLaren. And so for that reason, they're probably removed from the discussion entirely. It's obviously that second constructor that is the deciding factor, and given, as we know, constructors score so many points, it does become, along with your 2X driver, probably one of the most crucial ones you need to make. So I think, going into free practice in Canada, there was obviously a lot of chatter around Ferrari and McLaren being the only two teams in the A tier that were going to go rise in price. It seemed like an easy lock, assuming Leclerc and Hamilton had a pretty uneventful race. And obviously there was talk around Mercedes. They had a great race here last year, or in Canada, I mean to say. George Russell looked great in practice. Kimi Antonelli was there or thereabouts, but had kind of been a bit out of sorts lately. And so I think, as has been the case in weekends past in previous seasons and even in this season, if you're able to move to one of those premium assets early or before the curve, and I look at McLaren in 2023 as a prime example of that, if you got on them the week before they actually did well, I think it was Silverstone, or maybe even 1 week before that, Austria perhaps, in 2023, you would be rewarded with budget gain points and all of that good stuff that comes with being on trend. And I kind of look at Mercedes in Canada as exactly that same thing. It's the people that, I want to say they took a risk, but at the same time, on paper, George seemed to be one of, if not the best drivers on the grid through 3 practice sessions. And you can see their ownership ticked up by 14% in the top 500. Obviously, those people that moved to them early capitalized with very good rank swings. But 2/3 of the top 500 stuck with Ferrari. And you can see a lot of people moved off VCARB, a lot of people moved off Red Bull. There wasn't actually too much change to Ferrari's existing ownership. But if you go to the Patron 500, I think the swing was slightly more. It was. I mean, not by much, 2.7%, 2.6%. But I will say the ownership is higher. So I think there's, for Mercedes, and so I think there's obviously clearly a trend that if you can feel confident in an asset, constructor or 2X driver or whatever it is heading into the deadline, it might be a risk, but if it pays off, you can do really well. Now, on the contrary, there are also people, myself included, that played a similar approach for not the constructor, but in fact the 2X driver with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. And I think there is a similar mindset. I would say that was my approach. I don't speak for everyone in the F1 fantasy community, obviously. I'm just checking the audio's working fine. It is so far, so that's good. But I think that was a similar approach to Oscar Piastri versus Lando Norris. And again, looking at the data here, we can see that Oscar's ownership dropped by 10.3% in the Patron 500 and almost commensurately a similar drop for those who 2x'd him, because seldom do you find many people running Piastri and another premium driver unless you're on VCARB. And so I think the sentiment there in the lead up to the deadline was, look, Oscar's not looking very good. Lando seems to be more confident on track. Obviously, it didn't turn out to be the case, but the approach, I think, is really not going to be that different to whether you go for a premium asset in the driver or the constructor class. And I think the logic for me was, this feels like a weekend, as I said in my team selection video, to actually take advantage of Oscar not feeling like he's on it. He obviously turned it around in practice, in qualifying to finish in the top 3 there. So he's got ice in his veins, Piastri. I didn't really think there'd be a weekend I'd pivot off him at all this season unless there was a world in which he didn't look comfortable and confident on track, which I thought in practice it seemed so. And I think people were looking for that differential, that edge to get ahead of others that were very template heavy, that were McLaren, Ferrari, Piastri, 4.5s or other midfield drivers likely to rise in price. So for me, that was kind of the mentality originally around the pivot there. And I think there were not too many other people that... there were probably, at least, again, I'm making some assumptions, but of the few folks I spoke to that went down the Norris route kind of were looking for that opportunity to break away from the pack. So yeah, that was the thought process there for Lando. Obviously, it backfired, and I guess now we're at a juncture, kind of moving on to another of the points I wanted to talk about in this stream is what to do with Lando Norris. I know it's only a small cohort in the chat here tonight or today, and I will say hello to Frymer, Snivens, Colby, who have all dropped through recently. But I think there's understandable doubts for anyone that owns Lando as to whether or not he's viable. All you need to do, I think, right now, and I hate being the sole... I wouldn't say... I'm definitely not the kind of only person that realistically lives and dies by the budget builder. I think that's probably a little bit of an extreme there. But at the same time, it's obviously a facet of the game that you just cannot ignore, at least certainly not in the first half of the season. And there are going to be questions, and we'll talk about this in a second, of, when is the time to build budget versus focus on points? And I think right now, and I wouldn't be surprised if this remains the case until we get to the sprints in the second half of the season, is the approach of building budget, I still think holds true for most fantasy managers. And Norris, as we can see here, I think, again, for many assets, as Counts pointed out in the stream, it depends for many, at least your 2X driver and many of your premium assets, how they do in practice. I think practice performance for your premium assets holds more value than your budget drivers because, of course, there's that roulette or that risk factor or let's call it luck. I know some people hate the use of the word luck in fantasy games, but it's very much a factor regardless of kind of what your strategy is. And DNFs are such a part of the game that it can be a coin flip in midfield teams where it's more frequent than, say, the top drivers and the top teams. And so I think kind of where I'm going with that is with the budget, Lando, to look at him and his threshold to rise in Austria, 86 for a max rise or 58 for even a 0.1 is not even remotely attainable on a sprint, on a non-sprint weekend. And yes, I don't think in isolation to agree with, that contribution from Count in the chat. It's like no budget is not as important. And I agree with your comment. I don't think the budget 1-for-1 is more important. If you're looking at, say, this weekend, Piastri versus Russell, they don't have high thresholds to reach for max rises. I think it's attainable for both of them. But on the other hand, Lando, for instance, if you're like me and you've owned Lando through Canada, or you've got Lando from Canada and you're carrying him into Austria, if he doesn't hit 29 points, he is going down 0.3 million. Oscar, on the other hand, only needs 24 points for a 0.3 rise. So sure, the increments to increase in value and lose value are smaller, but when you look at the delta between Oscar and Lando, and there's that word again, delta, that seems to be prevalent in chip strategy with Limitless and again in price, that's a $0.6 million swing. So no, they don't actually go up as much as B tier assets, but the 0.3 up for Oscar and a 0.3 down for Lando is something I don't think you can just ignore entirely. Like, again, that's just my thought now. It will absolutely change in the second half of the year, particularly as we get closer to the sprints and you're trying to just find two premium drivers and constructors to squeeze into your team for that chip. And budget is not much of a focus when you're on the 3X, where points is the sole focus. But right now, that $0.6 million swing is equivalent to what any B tier driver could rise in price. And, I think most people that watch content creators in F1 Fantasy do probably prioritize some kind of hybrid that Joe's obviously pointed out between points and price gain. And that's been my mentality pretty much the whole way through this season. I think many teams or many players have a team 3 that is just all budget building, where it's 5, 6, 7 assets in the B tier that are going to rise at 0.6 every single week. And they might well be, upwards of 120 million in value, but I've obviously made that sacrifice on the points. I think the obvious approach, or at least I think it's obvious to me, is that a lot of teams are positioning themselves for those second half of the season leagues. So points don't really matter until the summer break. But I think going back to, most managers who are trying to find that nice little balance of points and budget, that's kind of why I think Oscar, George, Charles was a differential for the last couple of weeks as well. And that's where I think the real value for a 2X driver is between that 20 to 25 million if they're in a good car. Max, Lando, unless there's clear evidence to suggest that they are going to be an exceptional driver. And we've had weekends where Max has been popular at certain circuits simply because of the fact he has a great record there, or Red Bull has historically been a very good car at that track. There are Red Bull tracks, there are McLaren tracks, etc. I genuinely think where there aren't those kind of standout tracks or those obvious opportunities to pivot, like we've seen with Lando in Canada, that Oscar just feels like a ready-made 2X option. And I think his ownership speaks for itself. So that's kind of my 2 cents on the Piastri Lando Norris dilemma. And I do think it will be a very likely trade out of my team this weekend. So I'll pivot between these this screen and the budget builder and other F1 Fantasy Tools resources, just to kind of feed the discussion and kind of what that could look like from structuring my team for this week. But we're 20 minutes in, probably another 45 minutes left to go. I know I sound like a broken record. I've got a very small cohort of viewers tonight, but I do think if you're enjoying the content, throw a like on the video. It's going to be a much more laid back stream, as I said. So yeah, as you can see on the countdown timer, 5 days, 18 hours, 40 minutes, and 0 seconds until the next deadline. So lots to unpack and watch. And I think the beauty of these kind of streams is that they can just be very easy listening if you're driving home, if you're at work, if you're on the bus, even in your living room on a Sunday night in the United Kingdom, for example. You just want to throw on some F1 fantasy. And so I think there's it's something I might try out a little more of throughout the season. But yeah, that's Anyway, I'll stop rambling. So the next question, or next kind of talking point I wanted to address in the stream, was the Ferrari Mercedes. And William pointed it out before. And Frimer, I'll get to your question in Limitless in just a second. I haven't forgotten that in the chat. But Williams made a good point as to what is the approach for Ferrari, Mercedes, etc. I guess it kind of already was something we talked about for the first 5-10 minutes of tonight's stream. But I want to dig into the detail a little bit, and I'll obviously take that out. This is we'll work through my team and the rationale behind each of them. So first things first, Oscar most likely feels like a ready-made replacement for this week, going off the points we were just talking about. On to the second constructor slot. I'll leave that open for now. I'm not saying it's definitely Ferrari, definitely Mercedes. The conversation I want to have about the constructors is one that, as we talked about, something that seems to be rubber banding every couple of weeks. It's Mercedes for a couple of weeks, then it's Ferrari, and then it's maybe Red Bull or VCarb or whatever it is. And for me personally, it's I think many F1 fantasy managers can relate. I don't know, something just wigged out there. I think many F1 fantasy managers can relate to the point swings and the likelihood of one of these assets doing necessarily better than the other. For the constructors, we'll go down to the bottom here, because I think we'll start from the top with points, and then we can double click into pit stops and podiums and all of that other stuff. McLaren, no brainer. If you're watching these streams, you're an engaged fantasy manager, you should already own McLaren. There's no doubt in my mind, unless you're a late starter. I'd still honestly go with McLaren, even if you're a late starter to the party. The thing with this Ferrari Mercedes dilemma, and I do genuinely think it's going to be an option, a toss up between these two for the next few weeks, is largely dependent on practice, as it genuinely is. You can see based on the average per race, not always the best yardstick, but as one such benchmark, these guys are split by 2 points on average per race weekend. Ferrari obviously had that disqualification in China, which really hurt their season early on, and then Mercedes have had 3 stinkers in a row in the European triple header. So both of them have had their moments in the hot seat, and I don't think that necessarily changes anytime soon. I guess talking about it before, knowing when to jump onto these assets, it's hard to say well before practice. And when you watch videos like mine, you watch Ewan or Tom or whoever else it might be, we only can speak off recency. And I know that's not necessarily always the best yardstick for determining your lineup and figuring out what makes sense for your team on a week-to-week basis. But that's all we can really go off. I think there are inherent factors that are markedly synonymous with a particular team, and I take Ferrari and pit stops as a great example of that. They are, and have been for the entire season, an absolute weapon in the pit lane when it comes to changing tyres. And now that it's become more of a focal point in F1 fantasy scoring, Ferrari, in years past it's been Red Bull and it's been McLaren, but Ferrari this year seemed to be the dominant force by a long shot as well. And looking at the average here, 3 of the last 4 weeks, they've had 15 points out of a possible 15 on offer, or more on offer if you include the world record, which won't, I don't think, happen this season. But 15 seems about the ceiling for most race weekends. And so these guys are very good in their own right in that sense. Canada as well, because it was a multiple stop race, there's more opportunity for Ferrari to score points. And I think if we're looking at races that have multiple pit stops just based on tyre deg and such, then Ferrari have a better chance of scoring more points in the pit lane. I think in isolation, the Ferrari team themselves this season have not been very good. I think it's pretty well documented that they've struggled. The car is not up to the standard, certainly compared to the second half of last year where Sainz Leclerc had multiple wins. Sorry, not just in the second half of the year, but that was when the car became particularly competitive. These pit stop points are what is keeping them in the game every single week. If it wasn't for that, Ferrari would be nowhere close to a template asset right now. And I only say that because there's probably... I am fidgeting all over the shop with pressing buttons on the stream today. But I think Ferrari, these pit stops is what's making them and keeping them relevant. The only thing that has actually made them more of a compelling option, pit stops aside, in the last few weeks, has just been the drop-off in form with Mercedes. I think it obviously started with the DNF with Kimi in Imola, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Imola. And then their terrible qualifying results in Monaco, and then another struggle bus of a weekend in Spain. And so these guys have not really scored the points and been able to take points off Ferrari in the constructors department, in fantasy at least, and certainly in F1, in the F1 championship as well, that have made Mercedes less of a factor. And as a result, people naturally move towards a team that A, has a better opportunity for gaining budget, and B, in the case of Mercedes in the triple header, more reliability in the form of Ferrari. And I say reliability loosely because that team is not necessarily all of that. But I do think Ferrari are more, and probably undeservingly, in this dialogue we're having, or these deliberations we're having to make every single week, just because of these pit stops. 15 points, though, is not a small amount of money, or points, I mean to say, and that's the thing that's saving them and keeping them in the game. Yes, they're a few million more than the Silver Arrows, and the price, I think, is about $4 million difference, $4.4 million between Mercedes and Ferrari. So that's, again, not a small amount of money. That's the price of essentially almost what Liam Lawson is, or what Bortoleto and Colapinto are. Or Bortoleto is, I should say, because Colapinto, I think, has gone up 0.2 now. So that's the decision, and I guess the conundrum we're faced with is, do we chase a constructor like Mercedes that has that podium upside? Because we've seen George on the podium thrice this season, and his first win in Canada, Kimi's first win in Canada as well, first podium in Canada as well. And so you have to think, based on what we've seen so far this season, Mercedes have the higher upside compared to Ferrari. And the weekends where they've not been really in form have been those weekends where Ferrari have simply just capitalized on there not being another constructor to take points off them in F1 Fantasy. And as a result of that, just naturally become the second best option by virtue of the fact they may not go down in price because they haven't got trailing DNFs. And yeah. So, I mean, looking at the top scores between both of these teams this season, we've got a 73 for Ferrari in Bahrain. That was also a high overtake track where everyone seemed to score points there. 14 overtakes. So again, not a small number. These guys didn't even finish on the podium. And you look at a team like Mercedes, 13 points behind. Again, another chunk of overtakes. But that was the race, one of the races George Russell's finished on the podium this year. And that's, again, 2nd and 11th. George has obviously carried a lot of those Sunday points. But Ferrari, once again, another 15 points in the pit stop here. So that's becoming the factor in many of these races. That's why Ferrari 73 and then 71 in Monaco, another 15 points there. That's what's edging them. And so all we need to see from Mercedes, when we've had podiums, because George, I think, podiumed in Australia as well, didn't he? Yeah, he did. Kimi was 4th too. And so, actually, why don't we just go to the race result and we can see race position. You can see, yeah, George, 4 podiums plus the race win in Canada. And so that's what's driving Mercedes to outscore Ferrari when you're taking away. I mean, all we could honestly do is, if we take out the fast pit stops, I know it's such an important factor, so it should really be considered. But when you take out pit stops, Ferrari are lagging behind even Red Bull. And so that's clearly how dependent they are on them to keep them in the game fantasy-wise. Mercedes don't really have that same reliance. So I think if we see a performance or a trend in that direction from Mercedes in practice in Austria, then I don't see why Mercedes aren't going to be again another viable option for us heading into the upcoming deadline. So I don't know. I don't know if necessarily if you guys think that, you know, one team is necessarily better than the other, but my 2 cents is right now it feels as though the momentum is with the Silver Arrows, and it's a knee-jerk reaction to one race week. I don't want to get caught up in that, but you watch my videos, you watch any other content creators, Reigns, Adams, etc. A lot of what we're saying in our team selection videos, our reactions to the previous week, is for constructors especially just going to be based on how they perform and what that means for dictating our decisions into the race weekend prior to seeing practice. So I think, you know, going back to my team for the second slot, let's put in Mercedes for this week. Again, you've probably already seen kind of this build in my team selection and probably something similar in my final thoughts, but that's probably my thought process for here. Now, we're getting into the last 30 minutes or so of the video, and that also means probably the less interesting discussion around the rest of the team. Now, I think Liam Lawson, he DNF'd in Canada, and I think just again based on the fact that budget is becoming such a focal point and has been and will be for our fantasy teams, you do want to get rid of those toxic assets because a midfield driver scoring upwards of 20 points is non-existent. Oh wait, no, that's Hulkenberg and Alonso knocking on the door and saying, yes, I can do that in consecutive weeks, or double-digit points in consecutive weeks. So I do think a Lawson type driver, for someone especially that has, let's say, looked not so great this season. And I think he's had, fantasy-wise, weekends where he just has kept his nose out of trouble and has got to the finish line and made a few overtakes in an improving Racing Bulls, which Hadjar has shown can actually do very well. And Hadjar is the leading man in that team. But Lawson's ceiling is not that high. And I don't think there's really any justification for owning him while he's got this DNF sitting on his average. So for me, his going to his points here, somewhere between 3 and 9 is probably where I see what he scores most weeks when he doesn't DNF. Now, he's got one of these every couple of weeks, so tread with caution, obviously. Most people had him only for a couple of weeks to obviously offset that 14, but now that he's likely to go down 0.6 again, and, well, no, he will only go down 0.3. So for me, I personally want to get rid of him regardless, but I don't think a 0.3 drop is the end of the world, because as we can see here, he's currently 4.8, and, well, where is he? So he's 4.8, and as we know, you cannot go lower than 4.5 million F1 fantasy. So even if Lawson had another minus 20, he would only go down 0.3 million. So I think that's an argument to hold him. I don't think he's a buy, but I don't think he's an immediate sell. If you've got fires like Lando Norris or a constructor, you might own a Racing Bulls or something like that, then I think they're probably more priority transfers over Liam Lawson, who can only go down right now as much as an A-tier driver or constructor can too. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he has a 3-4 point masterclass in F1 fantasy in Austria. But at the same time, given he's only going to go down half of what he ordinarily would if he was a B-tier driver based on his recent DNF, suggests to me there's probably other priorities. But for me, as you can see on the screen here, and as I talked about in my team selection, as I'll talk about in my final thoughts, I'm almost set on using the wild card. And if I'm using it, I may as well get rid of assets I don't want in my team. So Lawson, for me, seems like an easy swap. Franco Colapinto, the other one. Now, he's at 4.7, just went up 0.2 million after marginally missing out on the max rise. And for me, I would say marginally. I think it was actually about 6 points, wasn't it? I can't remember. But anyway, he's only gone up 0.2. I've just not felt confident in Franco. Hot take, I would argue he's probably been one of the worst drivers on the grid from what we've seen from him this season. And there are probably other drivers out there that, to me, have not also had great years for their respective teams. But Franco, personally, has not really shown anything close to what he saw or what we saw from him in 2024. So, for that reason, I'm going to most likely part ways with the Argentinian, and it's quite a relief because every time I see him on track, in practice, in competitive sessions, Franco looks absolutely out of sorts. He was all over the shop in Canada, has crashed out in free practice. I think that was in Imola, if I can recall correctly. And so, I don't think everyone would necessarily say he is, as an F1 fantasy asset, the worst one going around. But a DNF for a driver like him, who we saw happen, I think it was twice last year, he DNF'd in consecutive races. Let's see. Let's pull the tape, pull the data. Because he is a driver that, I love this term, win it or bin it. You kind of go for broke, and if you don't kind of succeed with scoring points or whatever it might be, you'll put it in the wall. And this is Franco's scores down here from Monza from round 16 last year. When he came in at, was it the bottom? It was, pretty much the bottom, 4.8, so just above the bottom, above Logan Sargent. 11, 9, 6, 9, 8, and then he DNF'd in Qatar, wasn't it? Brazil, sorry, because it was a double DNF for Williams that weekend. Then 10 points, and then back-to-back DNFs to close out the year in Qatar and Abu Dhabi. So, you kind of get the good, and then you get the absolute. This is not even bad. This is borderline atrocious. And, the Argentinian fans, if there are any of you watching this, are probably going to come for me with pitchforks. I've kind of made my bed with this take, but I do think it's a take that it's particularly, as Counts pointed out, there's so little to play for a driver like Franco in the Drivers' Championship that to DNF 3 times in the last 4 races of the season, you don't want to be having that hanging over your head. You don't want that reputation if you've just broken into F1. Or also throw in the fact, didn't he also DNF'd in qualifying, didn't he? In Las Vegas, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. I'm almost certain he also hit the barrier in Las Vegas. So if you include that, he's had crashes in the last 4 races of 2024, and he's looked awfully shaky for just what we've seen generally this season. So, it's not someone that when I have in my team, I'm filled with a lot of confidence, to be honest. I look at him kind of like Logan Sargent last year, Franco Colapinto this year. You've got him in your team because he's dirt cheap and he enables upgrades to other parts of your team, like having Lando Norris as a 2X over Oscar Piastri as a differential, or having Ferrari McLaren instead of McLaren Mercedes. But there's an inherent risk that Colapinto is bound to, is bound to F it up. And I just know that's coming around. I know that's coming around the corner soon. So if I'm on wildcard again, it's almost like a transfer I want to make. It's a luxury transfer. I don't necessarily think that Franco himself as an F1 fantasy asset is a bad, I don't think it's egregious to own him. And a lot of us held him in Canada just solely because he had more budget upside than someone like Bortoleto. But I'm not exactly instilled with confidence when I own him. So, if he DNF'd, he'd go back down to 4.5. So much like Lawson, not much of a drop to follow if he, for whatever reason, went down in value. So that's kind of my thoughts on Franco and why, with him and Lawson, drivers I'm thinking about moving out. Now, the GOAT Nico Hulkenberg seems like a ready-made replacement. This other slot is somewhat up for debate. It could go, a number of different ways. I'd love to get Kimi Antonelli in at some point in the near future. The 120 millions could get George Russell if they were really frugal. I'm not close to that. I'm about a driver short, like a $4.5 million. So I could get Bortoleto in. I have $4 million short to obviously even get the 3 cheapest drivers in the game. The Kimi Antonelli dilemma for this second slot, and that doesn't mean I want to get rid of Hadjar, but with wildcard, you kind of have to think about every possible situation. Antonelli, for me, is a driver I think could factor into our teams at some point in the next few weeks. And he has had a bit of a rocky start not rocky start, because he had a blinder in Australia, then got driver of the day in China. Did he deserve that? Probably not, but most of the driver of the days this year have not deserved it. And I do think Kimi will become an option at some point in the next few weeks once these DNFs fall off his average, and obviously that Canada podium. So it actually may not be this weekend, but it could be the weekend after, where this 12 minus 12 falls off his average, and then his threshold to rise will be a lot lower. Not to mention he's a B tier asset, so could squeeze out. If he doesn't get 27 in Austria, the man could be in the box seat for a $0.6 million price rise the following race weekend. So Kimi's an option. And look, for argument's sake, I'm not saying now, but in a couple of weeks' time, we may well, if you play your cards right with chasing value, which is why I don't think budget suddenly goes away even at this point of the season. Some people could even afford him now with Franco Colapinto. I wouldn't recommend it, but I guess give it another week or two, and I think we could see a double McLaren, double Mercedes lineup, and I don't mind that at all. The very wealthy will probably give George Russell a shout, and I think if you can get to George Russell and Mercedes and budget drivers, I wouldn't be hesitating to do so in the near future. So yeah, that's kind of the thought here, but I'm at least a week, maybe two away from doing something like that. And so I want to give my team flexibility to pivot into a Kimi Antonelli lineup if I want to. We'll go to the chat because I haven't actually looked at the chat much. I've just been talking for about 30, 40 minutes, but I don't think there's been too much to, deviate from the narrative of what we've discussed. I think you're right, Jay. Colapinto did go up into the sevens last year. We'd have to look at the stats, but in the last race of the season, 7.4. So yeah, you're on the money there. And I think kind of so that was Sargent. So Colapinto, yeah. So Colapinto, sorry. Yeah, that was Colapinto, not Sargent. But yeah, he was a bit of a cash cow last year. I'm curious to see if that cash cow tag, it's been Hadjar, I think, and the Haas boys earlier in the season, whether we see a shift in the template to other assets like Alonso, for instance, who's 5.1, moving into that low cost, high upside to gain in an improving Aston Martin. And yeah, William, I agree. It's disappointing for Franco. I think there was a lot of hype for a lot of people to expect more from him, and he's just not quite delivered. So yeah, a couple other questions. There were two around Limitless. And I do want to get to that because it's certainly worth a discussion. I'll shout out the other person who mentioned it before. Freimer asked it before, and then Michael McKiernan, who, welcome Michael, has also dropped in, has asked about Limitless. And I think I wouldn't be using Limitless at Austria just because of the fact it's not a sprint race weekend. And it is a track that tends to have a relatively... Oh, no, it doesn't actually have that many opportunities to overtake. The main one is into turn 2, right? Where Max... Is that turn 2 or is that turn 3? But where Max and Lando came to blows last year. It's turn 2, isn't it? Yeah, because you just come up the first turn, then it's kind of like a fourth gear into the first turn, then it's flat out with the DRS up the hill. And yeah, so no, there aren't many overtaking zones at Austria, at the Red Bull Ring. And so I wonder if maybe turn 3. Thanks, James. Thanks for the correction. Then wait, where's turn 2? Is it like a little dent on the straight? I guess it has to be, right? Yeah, I don't know. Austria, it's just not... I don't know if it's really Limitless. Because it's... Yeah. You'd have to be confident that the top two teams, if it's apparent that it's Mercedes and McLaren, then go all in on it. Or if it's McLaren Ferrari. And I think the people that have really succeeded with Limitless this year, Saudi Arabia, Monaco, even Japan, have been able to, based on practice, really pick the best teams and drivers, the high scoring teams and drivers that week. It has to be clear. If it's not apparent in practice, then I don't know, Michael, if it's worth Limitless for me. It just doesn't feel like a Limitless weekend right now, but I could be wrong. I feel, again, I'd have to really drill into the maths for when other opportunities could be, but if you've seen my Limitless strategy video from a couple months ago now, Silverstone coming up is a relatively low overtake circuit, and it has had its moments with decent deltas to non-limitless teams. If you want to play a sprint weekend, I think Belgium is probably the last opportunity on the calendar for that. You're leaving it any later, and then you're getting into 3x territory or even no negative in Brazil. So I would probably keep that out. And then the other option, which I haven't really looked at, but Rain has talked about it in a couple of his videos, is Hungary, because it's a Monaco without walls, or at least that's the nickname. It's pretty low overtake track. So if it's a clear top two teams in practice, then I do think Hungary could be a potential candidate for anyone that's got Limitless on a team 2 or a team 3. And, you know, Jay's obviously thinking about his team 3 for Limitless in Silverstone, which I don't think's a bad shout at all, Jay. Yeah, I mean, William, Belgium probably. I don't know what the weather's going to be like in Spa, so that's the thing. It's one of my favorite tracks on the calendar. I love Spa, up there with Interlagos and Silverstone, but I don't know. You wouldn't want to use it at a wet race, and you kind of saw the havoc it wrecked when in Miami there was a bit of wet weather or a wet track. So yeah, it's a tricky one on Limitless. But I think there's probably some thought to be put into that for sure. All of my 3 teams have used Limitless. I used one in Saudi, one in Miami, and one in Monaco. Question from Paul was, what did you get your budget to last year? Mine was to end the season, I think about 127 for my team 1. Tell you what, why don't we go over to the season summary in F1. Oh, I don't think I had access to their premium tools last year. I'm pretty sure I didn't have access to. Yeah, I didn't have access to their premium tools last year. But if you do like access to F1 Fantasy Tools and accessing, you know, the season summary, which is a really good tool, I really like it. And this is the world number 1, not my team, Scott. But in my team 1, you can see the net positive or net negative changes to your team. Obviously, in Japan, I had an absolute stinker. Who DNF'd that race? Can you see that? No one. Just the Haas. The Haas 10 points just for a little bit of budget. So that was not great. And then Saudi Arabia was Pierre Gasly, obviously. I remember that. And then that was no negative in Miami. So a little bit of a save there. So you can see, you know, with the premium tools, their season summary, you can see points distribution where you score your major points. If you've hit fastest lap driver of the day, fast pit stop points, I've actually not had a great year with that, 14 out of 42. If you click on the world number 1, you can see like how much better they do compared to you. And like I said earlier, it's a bit of luck in F1 Fantasy to obviously capitalize on the maximum opportunities to gain. Even you go, so this is Scott Walmsley, world number 1. I was looking at this earlier. DNFs. He's only had 2 DNFs this season, the world number 1. I think I'm up to 7. Yeah, 7 DNFs and disqualifications. So team 2 is 5, team 3 is higher. Yeah, much higher. And so you can tell that, you know, DNFs are the most crippling metric in the game. The less you have, the better your team will be. And any team in the top 100, check out their DNFs. I guarantee you every single one will have less than 4 across the season. So just an interesting one. Hub 50 is the code for access to the premium tools, but you know, you can get a lot of features like the team calculator, budget builder, live scoring as well, just on their website free of charge. So in terms of going back to the rest of the team for the upcoming race weekend, I'll probably do another 10-15 minutes and call time. I'll see if there's any other questions in the chat. Paul, I don't know if I actually answered your question, but it was about 127, 128 million, I think, to end the year. James made the mistake of getting rid of Mercedes for Ferrari last weekend, but we'll wait for practice this time. Look, I mean, you can. The thing is, all it takes is a DNF and the narrative changes, right? I think it's very easy to be hindsighty in F1 Fantasy, given how those DNFs can shake out. and had James, Mercedes DNF'd in Canada, we'd be having a very different conversation to the one we're having now. So I wouldn't beat yourself up about it. I think you went the template route, and that was kind of the logic behind why I stuck with it. Charles had a pretty decent Saturday practice, and I think that was enough to move people away from Mercedes. Devo is asking, my team is Piastri, Leclerc, Hadjar, Hulkenberg, Lawson, McLaren, VCARB. Suggested trades this week. Looking at it on face value, I think Leclerc and VCARB. I think you've got to move off VCARB because looking at the budget builder, they are a very low likelihood to rise 0.6. I still think they can easily score 14 points, but with these B tiers, one DNF really cripples their propensity to score or meet those thresholds. So I would probably steer clear of that. If you wanted to stay with a B tier constructor, there aren't many. I just wouldn't go near Kick. They are on a generational F1 fantasy run right now that not even thresholds in the A tier can attain at the minute. So Kick are flying. They dropped to 4.5 million a couple weeks ago. They are crushing it, absolutely crushing it. So, look, I think for my teams, all three of them have A tier constructors in both slots. I think the viability of running B tier constructors is waning very, very quickly, and I would be very surprised if in a couple of weeks we have anyone on a B tier constructor. Even Williams, look at them 2 weeks ago. They were in Imola, talk of the town, and now they've had a total score over the last 2 weeks of -4. So it goes to show even the most reliable, I say reliable, but some of the stronger teams in the midfield are still struggling to squeeze points. So I think to answer your question, Devo, I'd probably move out Leclerc and I'd move out VCARB for a premium constructor like Ferrari, Mercedes, and then with whatever else you can afford, maybe squeeze in someone else into that budget driver slot. Only 2 DNFs, Williams says. For world number 1, you've got 9. 9! Wow, I thought I had it pretty bad. But, yeah, 9 is rough, William. I'm sorry, man. That's tough. That's like me 2024, where I had 25, 26 DNFs and disqualifications. Football Data is asking when the best time for limitless use is. I answered it just before, but it's probably my picks right now: Silverstone, Hungary, and Spa. So, in terms of kind of the rest of my team, let's, theoretically, of course, Hadjar, Hulkenberg probably, and then this last slot, it's a toss-up right now. I don't really know who goes in there. It could be Sainz. He can definitely get to 10 points. And so I'd like to go for him as a little bit of a differential in the elite data ownership. I like the patron more than the top 500. His ownership's ticking up a little bit. I'd say he's really at as low a price as I think he'll be all season, and I almost want to get ahead of that while I can. He has been quite unreliable this year, though. That's my concern. We'll go over to the stats page. A lot of it, or some of it's not been his fault, and it's just, again, like someone like Fernando Alonso, just wrong place, wrong time. So, when Sainz does score well, he can break 10 points pretty consistently. But you look at his score, he DNF'd in... he's had 3 DNFs this season. So, he had, obviously, Australia and Bahrain, right? Where was it? He's had 3. Has he not? I thought he had 3. Maybe not. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Oh, it was a sprint DNF. That's what it was, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Yes. I was like, I was 99% sure he had 3. So it was a sprint DNF in Miami. So, I think that for Sainz is probably, for me, is probably a nice little punt for Austria. So that's probably like what I'm thinking about right now on a wild card. Nijat's going, I'm going for Russell, Mercedes, Piastri, McLaren for Austria. Oh, wow. Nija, how's that budget, my friend? 120 million, I'm guessing. The rest of the cheapest options, but I think it's going to be good race for budget building with Alonso, Hulkenberg, Gasly. Yeah, I agree. I think Hulk's. I feel like this is a track Hulk could. It's an easy track to drive. So yeah. Fingers crossed Hulk can squeeze another 0.6. I don't think it's impossible for him. Matrodox is saying there's the possibility of going Piastri, Russell, Colapinto, Alonso, Bortoletto, Ferrari, Mercedes. What do you think? Yeah, 125 Ninja. Well done, man. Well done. Matrodox, I don't know if it's really a week or a time to go against the McLaren constructor. I still think they'll score a $0.3 million rise. I still think if both drivers finish the race, and I say that Lando didn't last year, and it's coming off a DNF in Canada, I just don't think McLaren are. I just don't think McLaren are a team you would bet against. You were essentially hoping for a DNF, and I wouldn't be gambling on McLaren not doing well until or unless we see something to suggest otherwise. So I think, yeah, if you can afford Nijat, if you can afford his lineup, then fantastic. But I think Matrodox, I'd be probably, I mean, it looks tempting, right? I don't think I can afford that lineup. Can I? Let's see. I don't think I can quite get to that George Russell. I'd have to downgrade quite a few to the cheapest. Would I do that? I don't know if I would. Not for my team, at least. Certainly not for my team. I don't think I'd do that at all. Not for my team. But I just think it's... McLaren are a set and forget. They are just a very reliable outfit. Even looking at their scores, their 40 is the only time this season, because it's their first DNF this year, where they've scored less than 70 points. So, take that reliability with a grain of salt, but I do think it's something you'd really hope and expect McLaren to do that poorly. They need to DNF. Like, if they still finish in the top 8, they're going to score at least 50 points, I would say, 40 to 50 points. So, yeah, I think bet against McLaren at your own risk. So, thoughts on Gasly? Yeah, Doug, I mean, Gasly's been an interesting one, hasn't he? Because I'll put my team up. We've probably got 5 to 7 minutes left on the stream anyway. But I'll put my team up, what we are likely going to go with this weekend. Thoughts on Gasly? So, Gasly's probably the most frustrating driver to own in F1 Fantasy, or one of the most frustrating drivers to own in F1 Fantasy. Obviously, just had the budget builder up, and I do think Pierre has been hard done by with a lot of bad results, whether it's something he's attributed to or another driver has taken him out. Gasly is probably not at the top of my list. He only needs 5 points for a max rise. So the argument to own him is a solid one, but he is a revolving door of DNFs. And I'm not saying I'd be very surprised if he DNF'd again in Austria, but every 3 races, PS seems to have a disqualification in China or a DNF, as we saw in Bahrain and again in Monaco. That screws anyone that's got him to own for a budget rise. Now, you take the DNFs out of the equation, and Pierre's more likely scoring between 8 to 12. Maybe at the moment the car has gone back a little bit, so maybe 5 to 10 points a week. He had 13 at a high overtake track in Bahrain. He had 18 on a sprint race in Miami, and then he had 10 points at Spain, another high overtake track. And he finished in the points. So I won't take anything away from that. A good weekend for Pierre. But his 2 highest scores have been on high overtake or sprint weekend tracks. And for that reason, I think those 2 high bars are a little misleading for Pierre. Again, it doesn't actually mean that much because his threshold is only 5 points. I think he could become an option for me. I'm not ruling that out. I just think for right now, I prefer the opportunity for Sainz. Honestly, I wouldn't be against the idea of taking out Hadjar. I think in a few weeks, Isaac Hadjar doesn't become template like he currently is. His points right now to his price, you're needing... The more 0.6s he gets, Isaac Hadjar, the harder it is for him to obviously maintain those low thresholds. And I'm not basing a decision on a pattern, not at all. But I think for someone like Gasly and someone like Hadjar, for me, Gasly is kind of at the bottom of... I think he's at as low as he'll get, much like Sainz. I think those two drivers are at a very low point for their price this season. You won't find too many more opportunities to get them at this kind of price. Hadjar, on the other hand, though, he is probably closer to his price ceiling. I'd be surprised if he ever gets above 8 million this year. And I think that's just because of the car itself. This is an incredible run of consistency from a rookie driver in F1 Fantasy. I'd be shocked if we had, with the exception of maybe Oscar Piastri when that McLaren looked really good a couple years ago when those mid-season upgrades worked, where you'd find another rookie driver in F1 Fantasy in the last few years with this level of production. I think Isaac is a great asset in a great car, and for his price, 6.7, that's not expensive. I think you can run that without hesitation and not bat an eye based on what he can do in the car. But at the same time, there will be a time, maybe not now, maybe not in the next race, but maybe in 3 or 4 races where he's at 7.5 million, close to 8 million. And these thresholds to meet for a max rise are becoming harder and harder to get to. And I'm thinking, do I premeditate that a little bit? I don't know right now if I would in Austria, but I am thinking about it because I think he is a transfer out down the line at some point, and all it takes is a DNF for him to become a toxic asset. So we'll have to wait and see. He hasn't had one since Australia, so for now I think he's a perfectly fine hold at the moment. So yeah, this is potentially what my team could look like. It could be Gasly instead of Hadjar. I'll think about it. I really will think about it. And Gasly cheaper than Hadjar. That's actually that feels like a steal. Like, if you look at this lineup, these are all very experienced drivers that are, in my opinion, with the exception of Hulk, Alonso, Gasly, Sainz, I think are all underpriced for what you're getting from them. So I might be tempted to move off Hadjar and go for Gasly. And yes, the pattern of the $0.6 million drops every 3 races for a DNF for Gasly is not something you can obviously foresee, but it's not something I think you should ignore entirely either. Thanks, Dezex. Appreciate the stream. Love. Setting up for Limitless in Spa. What B constructor would you suggest for the next 1 to 2 races? As I have V-Carb and Leclerc will probably have to wildcard. B tier constructor right now, there isn't really one, to be honest. I think Alpine are too slow. I'd probably actually say Aston Martin, to be honest. I'm really liking what I've seen from Alonso. The upgrades are showing that I think a driver like Alonso can optimize the performance of that car. It's largely hinging on the window licker to do his part, which hasn't been the case. He had a great start to the season, but it's been absolute crickets. Aside from his Miami 25 pointer, he's not been all that great since the second race of the season. So I think Stroll, you need him to hold up his end of the bargain. And if he can't do that, then Aston Martin flop. But I'm confident if Alonso can deliver these 15 to 20 point performances, I'm not saying it's happening every week, but I think if Alonso can turn in some decent results from time to time, then Aston Martin are going to do enough to score 15 or 20 points for a price rise. So I think, to answer your question, that's probably who I'd be going for. I know leaving 5 million is cringe, but that's kind of the state of the game. You can either get to Piastri, Mercedes, McLaren, Russell, or you're left with these middling midfield drivers. So, like, what else can you do, though? That's the thing. It's like Matrodox, I agree with your point. A lot of people are in the same dilemma, but like, what else can you do with a team like this? Some people can get to Kimi. I think he's personally another wait and see for 1 more week. And then but beyond that, it's Yuki Tsunoda, who has looked well out of sorts for Red Bull. Aside from that, Albon absolutely not. Stroll probably not. And then it's Sainz. Like, Yes, you could go Verstappen. I think someone suggested, do you actually think about going Max? It was Ferrari. Do you think about switching out Piastri with the 2x Verstappen? I'm on a wild card, and I want a wild card into a team I can hold for a couple of weeks with a lot of reliable assets. And so for me, I wouldn't be going with Max just because I think he's a transfer out. If not the following week, definitely the week after, just because I think Oscar's better value in a better car. So no, I don't think personally for me I'm game enough to do Max, but I can't fault anyone who backs him. Hello, Jeremy. You've timed it. I wouldn't say great, mate. We're probably about to wrap up in the next couple minutes. So, but great to have you drop through the stream. And, you know, there's 75 of us hanging out today. So it's not by any means a huge stream, but there goes the dishwasher again, if you can hear that. But I do think, yeah, there's going to be a bit of chatter around what to do and how to approach our teams and our decisions, especially for the 2X this weekend. So yeah, guys, I might park it. It's just over an hour on a Sunday afternoon for me, and I know it's quite late for the folks in Europe, early for the folks in the Southern Hemisphere, in Asia and Australia, New Zealand. Shout out to Jeremy. But I think yeah, I might pack it up. I'll answer any couple of questions, and I'll ask you guys to do me a favor and throw a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. A question from Matrodox. Nothing to do. I'm considering max budget build for Austria, then go 3 to 4 million up and have two premiums for a race later. I'm 116.5 now, 4.8 global rank. Great work on the rank. Maybe worth sacrificing some points. Can you hear the dishwasher? I'm sorry, man. I put it on and it took longer than I put it on an hour and a half before the stream and it's still going. So I don't know what kind of mode my dishwasher's on right now, but yeah, it's been a bit of a funny old stream, as they always are. So yeah, I think Matrodox, you kind of just park it and then build budget, sacrifice a little bit of point on the points front, but I think for the most part, there's nothing wrong with trying to position your team to accrue more value and focus on, maybe a couple of weeks down the line when you can get to 4 premium or 4 A-tier assets. Jay's dropped in and asked, first time playing this season, only up to 104 million. Any tips? Jay, I would watch my budget building video, but in terms of your team to structure, I'd go probably like a McLaren, Piastri, Alonso. I don't know, what could you afford for 104? Because I'm like 116, right? Let's see. For 104, let's just throw in a B tier like Aston Martin for argument's sake. Let's throw in Gasly, Bortoletto. No, that's... You could do better than that, I think. What is F1... What does F1 Fantasy Tools say on their team calculator? 104 tab. Oh. McLaren, Mercedes, Piastri. Apologies. I didn't know you could get to McLaren. I do one of these teams for Jay Bustelino. And yeah, that's like 103.09. Like, I think that's a really good team. In all honesty, most people this weekend will probably have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the same assets, and the only difference will be these two. So I think if you can find an opportunity to copy the template as much as possible with a low budget, I'd take advantage of that. And then Urasoto, what do you think of projecting for the next race and thinking about bringing in Bortoletto and Mercedes for a Kimi next race? I don't think I said before, Urasoto, I don't think it's in Austria, but I think it's the race after, which is Silverstone, correct? So it is Silverstone, isn't it? And then Belgium right before the break. Austria, Silverstone, Belgium. Yeah. So I think, I think people who want to focus on budget for the next couple races to position themselves for a Mercedes Russell or a Mercedes Antonelli, then I think that's perfectly fine. So anyway, guys, I'm going to leave it there. It was a quick 70 minutes on a Sunday. I just thought I'd do something a little different, see if it kind of fits the vibe of the channel. There's been, 350, 400 of you come through in the last hour or so. A pretty low-key stream, nothing too crazy, but thought I'd just unpack kind of what we're going through the week off in between races and what that means for our F1 fantasy teams. I'll refresh my screen, but you'll see all of this right before my final thoughts video goes out. So I'm going to leave it there for now. As I said, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. You like the content. If you like the content, like the video. And I will be back with my final thoughts video ahead of the Austrian Grand Prix, but no deadline stream for me this weekend or the following race, just because I am traveling. And I will be still doing my team selection videos. I may not be able to get to 2 videos a week just because I'm on the road and in the air and non-stop. I will actually be in Europe, so we'll be on a similar time zone to many of you who pop through, but the frequency of content in the next couple of race weekends will be fewer and further between. So the content doesn't stop, but the cadence slows just a little bit. So as I said, guys, drop a like on the channel, subscribe to the channel, drop a like on the video, and as I said, have a great rest of your day. Stay posted for my content coming up to the next deadline, and I